There are moments in sacred history that have been painted so many times we think we know every detail. The road to Calvary, the weight of the cross, the crowd pressing close, the soldiers, the dust, the weeping women, the sky darkening above Jerusalem as if creation itself could not bear to watch. These images have been carved into churches, stained into glass, whispered through centuries of prayer, and held in the minds of believers as the most solemn walk ever taken. But according to one forbidden text, Christ was not alone, not in the way Scripture tells it, not surrounded only by Roman guards, mourners, and those who followed from a distance. The hidden gospel speaks of another presence on the road, a second figure moving behind him with every step. It was not a disciple, it was not an angel, it was not one of the soldiers, nor a demon waiting to mock his suffering. It was something darker, quieter, and far harder to explain. The manuscript calls it only the shadow that remembered. It did not speak, it did not touch him. It did not try to stop the nails or soften the lash. It simply followed, close enough to be seen by those whose eyes were breaking under grief, but distant enough to be forgotten by those who survived the day. In the text, it moves behind Christ like a second body made from absence, taking the shape of his pain as though suffering itself had been given form. That is what makes the gospel of the shadow Christ so disturbing. It does not deny the crucifixion. It does not rewrite the passion into something unrecognizable. Instead, it adds one impossible detail to the story we already know, and that detail changes everything. Because if there was a shadow behind the cross, if something walked with him and carried the memory of every wound, then the crucifixion may have left behind more than salvation. It may have left behind a witness. The Church has never acknowledged such a gospel. No public canon lists it. No accepted apocrypha preserves its name. Yet scattered references appear in monastery inventories, private letters, and damaged theological warnings from centuries ago. A dark companion, a second shape beneath the cross, a memory of wounds that did not ascend, always described indirectly, as if even naming it too clearly would bring it closer. Some scholars dismissed these fragments as symbolic. They argued that the shadow represented humanity's sin, grief, or the spiritual weight of suffering. But the forbidden text speaks of it differently. Not as metaphor, but as presence. Something that moved, something that watched, something that remained after the body was taken down and the tomb was sealed. And if the gospel is to be believed, that shadow did not disappear after Calvary. It followed the centuries. It appeared in plague houses, battlefields, execution chambers, hospital rooms, and places where human suffering became too heavy to vanish cleanly. Wherever pain was ignored, the shadow remembered. Wherever blood dried before justice arrived, the shadow remained. It became the witness no one invited, the record no one could destroy, the darkness that walked behind the wounded and carried what the world refused to hold. Tonight, we enter one of the strangest corners of forbidden Christian lore, the hidden text known only as the Gospel of the Shadow Christ, a gospel that claims suffering was not only endured, not only redeemed, but remembered by something that has followed humanity ever since. Welcome to Tales from the Forbidden Library, where the oldest stories do not always end where Scripture says they do. The first known reference to the Gospel of the Shadow Christ comes from an inventory written in the late 1600s, inside a monastery built into the limestone cliffs of northern Spain. The monastery had no grand reputation. It was not famous for relics, miracles, or pilgrimage. It was a cold, narrow place, half hidden by mist and rock, where monks copied scripture in silence and buried their dead beneath the chapel floor. For centuries, the monastery's altar held a large wooden crucifix carved from dark olive wood and mounted above the sanctuary. The monks claimed it had been there since the earliest days of the building, though no one knew who had made it. The figure of Christ was unusually thin, almost stretched, with ribs carved so sharply they looked less like anatomy and more like script. But the strangest detail was not the body on the cross. It was the shadow beneath it. No matter how the candles were arranged, the crucifix cast the wrong shadow. During morning prayer, when sunlight entered from the eastern window, the shadow should have fallen behind the altar. Instead, witnesses claimed it appeared slightly to the left, elongated along the stone floor like a second figure standing behind the cross. At night, when the chapel was lit only by candles, the shadow sometimes moved before the flame did. The monks recorded these observations in private, not as miracles, but as disturbances. In 1732, an earthquake cracked the chapel wall and split the altar stone down the center. Repairs began immediately, but when the monks removed the crucifix from its mount, they discovered something hidden behind it. A narrow cavity had been carved into the stone, sealed with wax, and covered by a thin plate of blackened metal. There was no inscription on the plate, only a small symbol. A cross with a second, darker line drawn behind it, as though something stood in its wake. Inside the cavity was a manuscript wrapped in linen that had darkened with age. The pages were brittle, water-stained, and stitched together with thread that looked almost black. At first, the monks assumed it was a passion text, perhaps an old devotional account of Christ's suffering. But when the abbot opened it, he found no title, no blessing, and no author's name. The first line simply read, "There was another who walked behind him, and the earth remembered its shape." The manuscript was written in Latin, but not cleanly. Several phrases appeared to have been translated from Greek or Aramaic, and some words had been left untouched, as if the scribe feared changing them. The handwriting shifted throughout the text. Some pages were neat and disciplined, others were cramped and frantic, with ink pressed so deeply into the parchment that it nearly cut through the skin of the page. Whoever copied the manuscript had not done so calmly. The story it told began on the road to Calvary. It described Christ carrying the cross while the crowd gathered around him, exactly as countless passion accounts had done before. But then, the text changed. Behind Christ, it said, there moved a shadow, not cast by his body. It bent when he fell. It stretched when he stood. It darkened whenever blood touched the ground. And when the soldiers struck him, the shadow trembled as if the pain had entered it too. The monks who read the manuscript were unsettled by the precision of the writing. It did not speak like poetry or metaphor. It described the shadow as something observed by witnesses, something present in the physical world, something seen by a few and forgotten by many. One passage claimed that a woman in the crowd looked directly at it and began to weep, not for Christ alone, but for the thing that suffered without flesh. By the third page, the abbot ordered the reading stopped, but it was already too late. Several monks had heard enough to begin asking questions. Why had the manuscript been hidden behind the crucifix? Why seal it beneath wax and metal instead of destroying it? And why had the crucifix itself, for all those years, cast a shadow that seemed to point toward the place where the pages were buried? The abbot locked the manuscript inside the sacristy and forbade anyone from speaking of it. Yet over the following weeks, strange things began happening in the chapel. The candles burned lower than they should. The crucifix, once remounted, no longer cast any shadow at all. And during evening prayer, some monks reported hearing footsteps behind them, soft and slow, as if someone were walking down the aisle without entering through the door. One younger monk, Brother Matteo, became obsessed with the hidden text. He believed it was not heresy, but testimony. He argued that the shadow was not an enemy of Christ, nor a rival, nor a demon waiting at the edge of suffering. It was the remnant of the passion itself, the part of the crucifixion too heavy for history to carry. If Christ bore the sins of the world, Matteo wrote, then perhaps something else was made to bear the memory of what was done to him. Matteo disappeared before winter. His cell was found empty, his bedding folded, his shoes still beneath the bed. On his desk lay a copied fragment from the manuscript, written in careful Latin. The ink was fresh. Beneath the copied line, he had added one sentence of his own. "It does not follow him anymore. It follows us." The manuscript was sealed again soon after. The monastery records claim it was sent to a higher authority for examination, but no receipt exists, no archive lists its arrival, and no official church document acknowledges its transfer. All that remains is the old inventory note, written by an unknown hand. One gospel fragment, concealed behind the crucified, concerning the second shadow, not to be read aloud. The Gospel of the Shadow Christ did not claim that everyone saw the shadow. That may be the most unsettling part of it. If the manuscript had described a grand cosmic apparition, visible to the entire crowd, it would have been easier to dismiss as symbolic invention. But the text is more careful than that. It says the shadow was seen only in fragments, only by those whose grief had broken their ordinary sight, and only in moments when suffering became too heavy to belong to one body alone. According to the hidden manuscript, several people noticed something behind Christ on the road to Calvary, but none could hold the memory for long. A woman saw it when he fell beneath the weight of the cross. A soldier glimpsed it when the whip tore skin from his back. A child saw it stretch across the dust when blood touched the ground. Each witness reacted differently, but the result was always the same. They looked away, and by the time they looked back, they could no longer explain what they had seen. The text describes this forgetting not as ordinary fear, but as a kind of mercy. It says the human mind was not made to carry certain forms of witness. To see pain is one thing. To see the memory of pain take shape behind the one who suffers is another. Those who saw the shadow understood, even if only for a heartbeat, that the crucifixion was not happening in one moment alone. It was becoming something larger, something that would continue long after the nails were removed. One passage tells of Mary Magdalene turning toward the road after hearing a sound that no one else noticed. Not a cry, not a footstep, something closer to a second breath following Christ's own. The manuscript says she saw a dark shape moving behind him, bent beneath no cross, yet burdened as if carrying every wound before it was made. She tried to speak, but the words vanished on her tongue. By evening, she remembered only that she had seen something impossible, and that it had looked at her with no face. Another passage mentions John, though not by name. It refers only to the beloved witness, who stood close enough to see both the body and the shadow at once. According to the manuscript, he understood more than the others, but still not enough. He saw that the shadow did not imitate Christ perfectly. It lagged behind him by half a step, as though time itself hesitated around it. When Christ stumbled, the shadow fell first. When Christ bled, the shadow darkened before the wound opened. This detail terrified the monks, who later studied the text. If the shadow moved before the wound, then it was not only remembering suffering, it was anticipating it. The manuscript seemed to suggest that pain had a memory before it happened, that every wound exists somewhere before it enters flesh. To medieval theologians, that idea was dangerous. It made suffering feel less like an event and more like a force with its own intelligence. But the strangest witness in the Gospel is not one of the known disciples. The text refers to an unnamed scribe standing at the edge of the crowd, a man who had followed the procession not out of faith, but curiosity. He was not there to mourn. He was there to record. He carried a wax tablet beneath his cloak and wrote down what others were too afraid to say aloud. The manuscript claims that he alone remembered the shadow clearly because he had not loved Christ enough for grief to blind him. That line is one of the darkest in the entire Gospel. It suggests that love itself became part of the forgetting. Those who loved Christ could not bear to remember the second figure. Their sorrow softened the memory, buried it, turned it into a feeling rather than an image. But the scribe, detached and watchful, saw everything. He saw the shadow follow the cross. He saw it bend at each cry. He saw it grow larger as the sky darkened. Later, when the disciples gathered in fear and confusion, several spoke of strange impressions from the road. One remembered a darkness that did not belong to the weather. Another remembered feeling that someone else was walking behind them, though no one was there. A third began to describe a figure beside the cross, then stopped mid-sentence and wept without knowing why. The manuscript says their memories folded inward like cloth around a wound. The unnamed scribe tried to tell them what he had seen. At first, they listened. Then their faces changed, not with disbelief, but with recognition they could not keep. The more he described the shadow, the less certain they became. One by one, they forgot the details even as he spoke them. By the time he finished, none could repeat what he had said. Only the scribe remained certain. This is why the gospel of the shadow Christ may have been written in the first place. Not as a gospel of teaching, not as a gospel of salvation, but as a record of a thing almost everyone forgot. The unnamed scribe understood that memory was already failing around him. He feared that if he did not write the shadow down quickly, it would vanish from human history entirely, leaving only an ache where the truth had been. The manuscript claims that the scribe began writing before sunset, while the hill of Golgotha still smelled of iron and dust. He wrote in fragments because the memory resisted order. He described the shadow as the second witness, the wound without skin, and the body of remembering. None of these names satisfied him. Every title seemed too small. Every word turned the thing into something less than what it was. By dawn, he had filled several pages. By the following night, he could no longer remember writing some of them. His own text began to frighten him. Lines appeared in his hand that he did not recall composing. Phrases repeated themselves in different places. Once, in the margin beside a description of the nails, he found a sentence written darker than the rest. I remember what you cannot. No one knows what happened to the scribe. The manuscript never gives his name, and perhaps that was intentional. Some later readers believed he erased himself from the account out of humility. Others believed the shadow took his name as payment for remembering too much. In one damaged passage near the end of the text, the scribe writes that every time he tried to sign his testimony, the ink blurred before it dried, so the witness remained nameless, just like the shadow he followed. One preserved what the other carried. One wrote in ink, the other wrote in pain. And between them, according to the forbidden gospel, there survived a memory that even the apostles could not bear to keep. That is why the church feared the text. Not simply because it added another figure to the passion, but because it suggested that the official witnesses had not remembered everything. It suggested that something stood close to the holiest suffering in history, and that those closest to it forgot what they saw. And if the apostles themselves could forget such a thing, then perhaps forgetting was never weakness. Perhaps it was protection. That is why the church feared the text. Not simply because it added another figure to the passion, but because it suggested that the official witnesses had not remembered everything. It suggested that something stood close to the holiest suffering in history, and that those closest to it forgot what they saw. And if the apostles themselves could forget such a thing, then perhaps forgetting was never weakness. Perhaps it was protection. According to the manuscript, the shadow did not appear fully formed at the beginning of the procession. At first, it was only a darkness beneath Christ's feet, darker than the dust and sharper than any ordinary shade. But as the road continued, the shadow began to separate from him. Not enough to become independent, but enough to suggest that something within the suffering had gained shape. Each wound gave it more definition. Each act of cruelty made it clearer. When the soldiers struck him, the shadow trembled. When the crowd mocked him, the shadow widened across the stones. When he fell, the shadow did not fall beneath him. It fell beside him as if a second body had collapsed under an invisible weight. The manuscript says that for a moment, those close enough to see it felt a strange terror, because the shadow looked less like darkness and more like someone kneeling. One passage describes the lashings in a way that disturbed even hardened theologians. The text claims that every time the whip opened Christ's skin, the wound appeared first within the shadow, not as blood, but as a line of deeper blackness. The mark would spread through it like ink in water, then settle into place, preserved without fading. The implication was unbearable. The shadow was not merely following suffering, it was receiving it before the world fully understood what had been done. The hidden gospel calls this process the keeping of wounds. It says that some pain is too great to disappear when the body heals, too sacred or too terrible to be absorbed by time. Such pain must go somewhere. It must be held by something. The shadow, according to the text, became that vessel, not a savior, not a substitute, but an archive of agony. This is where the manuscript begins to move beyond the passion itself. The writer claims that the shadow did not only remember Christ's wounds, it remembered every wound that gathered around him. The grief of Mary, the fear of the disciples, the cruelty of the soldiers, the indifference of the crowd. Every emotion that touched the crucifixion entered the shadow and remained there, layered like pages in a book no one could close. That idea made the gospel dangerous in a way ordinary heresy was not. It suggested that suffering was not erased by being redeemed. It was remembered, carried, preserved somewhere in creation, like a record that could not be destroyed. The shadow became the place where pain went when history tried to move on too quickly. One of the most haunting lines in the manuscript reads, "And when they pierced him, the shadow opened, and all wounds found their mirror." No accepted gospel contains anything like it. No church teaching speaks of a second vessel beside the cross. Yet the line appears repeatedly in later references to the text, as if those who encountered it could not forget it, even when they wanted to. The nails receive special attention in the hidden gospel. The writer describes them not as instruments of execution alone, but as points of transfer. When the first nail was driven through the hand, the shadow stretched violently across the hill. When the second struck, the sky darkened. When the feet were pierced, the shadow gathered beneath the cross, like spilled ink returning to its source. Those present thought the darkness came from the heavens, but the scribe insists it rose from the ground. The manuscript does not claim the shadow suffered instead of Christ. That distinction matters. It insists Christ suffered fully, terribly, in flesh and spirit. But the shadow remembered what flesh could not keep forever. The body would die. The body would be taken down. The body would be wrapped and placed inside the tomb. But the shadow remained outside, holding the shape of every wound after the blood had dried. This is why some later monks called it the wound without skin. Others called it the second passion. A few, in private letters, called it the memory Christ left behind. None of those names were accepted. All were condemned, because each one suggested that something of the crucifixion remained unfinished, not in the sense of salvation, but in the sense of witness. The gospel becomes stranger after the death on the cross. When Christ gives up his spirit, the text says the shadow did not vanish. Instead, it grew still. The crowd looked toward the body, the soldiers toward the sky, the women toward the face they loved. But the shadow stayed fixed upon the wounds. It did not mourn like a person. It observed like something built for one purpose only, to ensure nothing was forgotten. Then came the moment that made later authorities fear the manuscript above all. As the body was taken down, the shadow did not remain beneath the cross. It followed the blood trail. It moved across the stones, over the feet of those who carried him, and toward the place where the linen waited. One witness, according to the scribe, saw it pass over their hands and felt every sorrow they had ever buried return at once. That person collapsed and woke unable to speak for 3 days. The hidden gospel says the shadow stood outside the tomb after the body was sealed within. Not at the entrance like a guard, but slightly behind it, where no torchlight reached. It remained there through the night, carrying the wounds that the stone could not contain. The scribe writes that the earth was quiet around it, not peaceful, but ashamed. The shadow does not rebel. It does not attack. It does not corrupt the passion into something else. It simply remembers too much. And in doing so, it forces the reader to confront a question most traditions would rather leave untouched. If pain is redeemed, does that mean it is gone, or only that something else has agreed to carry it? By the end of this section, the scribe no longer writes like a detached witness. His language becomes personal, almost pleading. He seems to understand that the shadow is not confined to Golgotha. If it can carry the wounds of Christ, then perhaps it can carry others too. Perhaps every act of cruelty creates a darkness that remembers. Perhaps every forgotten suffering casts a shape somewhere behind the world. The final paragraph of this section is badly damaged, but a few lines remain. They are among the most quoted in forbidden commentaries on the text. Do not say the wounds are gone because the body has risen. Do not say the blood is forgotten because the stone is empty. There is a shadow behind all mercy, and it remembers what mercy forgives. The church did not fear the gospel of the shadow Christ because it denied the crucifixion. That would have made it simple. Heresy can be named, challenged, and condemned. A false gospel that mocks Christ, rejects the resurrection, or contradicts doctrine openly can be burned with confidence. But this manuscript did something far more difficult to confront. It accepted the passion. It accepted the suffering. It accepted the holiness of what happened on Calvary. Then it added a second witness no one knew how to explain. That was the danger. The shadow did not appear as an enemy of Christ. It did not tempt him, oppose him, or claim authority over him. It walked behind him. It trembled when he was struck. It darkened when he bled. It remained when others fled. To those who first read the hidden gospel, this was not ordinary blasphemy. It was something more unsettling, an addition that sounded almost reverent, almost sacred, and therefore far harder to reject without asking what it meant. The earliest theological warning attached to the manuscript described it as a text that wounds belief by standing too close to truth. That phrase appears in a damaged Latin note believed to have been written by a church examiner in the late 1300s. He did not call the gospel demonic. He did not accuse it of inventing lies. Instead, he wrote that the text was dangerous because it makes suffering visible beyond its permitted end. That line reveals the heart of the fear. Christian teaching placed the crucifixion inside a sacred arc. Suffering, death, resurrection, redemption. The wound becomes victory. The cross becomes salvation. The tomb becomes empty. But the gospel of the shadow Christ refused to let suffering vanish so cleanly into triumph. It suggested that pain does not simply disappear because it has been redeemed. It suggested that something remains behind, remembering every wound even after mercy has spoken. For priests and theologians, that idea was explosive. If the shadow remembered every wound of Christ, then what else did it remember? Every martyr burned in secret, every child buried without a name, every prisoner tortured beneath a holy banner, every war blessed by men who claimed God stood with them. The shadow became more than a strange companion to Christ. It became an accusation against history itself. That may be why the manuscript was never debated publicly. No council records mention it by name. No sermon refutes it directly. Instead, references appear in private warnings, monastery inventories, and sealed letters between abbots. The text was treated not like a doctrine to be corrected, but like a contagion to be contained. Those who read it were not asked what they believed. They were asked what they saw afterward. Because according to several accounts, the shadow did not stay on the page. Monks who studied the manuscript claimed to notice it first in candlelight. A second darkness behind their own bodies, moving a fraction too late. A shape cast in the wrong direction. A smear along chapel walls, where no object stood to block the flame. At first, these reports were dismissed as fear, exhaustion, or guilt. But then the same details appeared in monasteries separated by hundreds of miles. One reader wrote that after copying only 3 lines from the Gospel, he could no longer pray without feeling someone standing behind him. Not a demon, not a saint, something silent and sorrowful, present only when he spoke of forgiveness. Another monk claimed that during confession, he saw a shadow behind the penitent that did not belong to the person kneeling before him. It seemed larger, older, and bent beneath invisible weight. The church's fear deepened when the shadow became associated with memory. In one suppressed commentary, a bishop wrote that the gospel teaches the wounded to distrust absolution. He argued that if suffering leaves behind a witness, then forgiveness does not erase the moral reality of what was done. To put it plainly, the shadow made it harder for institutions to bury pain beneath ceremony. And institutions survive by controlling memory. The manuscript implied that there was a record beyond human record, a witness beyond official witness, a darkness that preserved what power preferred to forget. That idea was unbearable to those who depended on finality. Trials end. Confessions are absolved. Wars are justified. Graves are covered. But the shadow, if real, stood behind all of it and remembered. This is why some later texts began calling it the Archive of Wounds. Not because it wrote with ink, but because it carried suffering in form. Every cruelty dismissed as necessary, every death called unfortunate, every scream ignored because it belonged to someone powerless. All of it, according to the forbidden gospel, had a shadow. All of it remained somewhere. The most controversial passage in the Church's response came from a letter attributed to Cardinal Severian, though the authenticity is still disputed within the law surrounding the text. In it, he warns that the gospel of the shadow Christ must never be read to the grieving, the condemned, or the unjustly punished. His reasoning was not that they would lose faith. His fear was worse. He believed they might recognize the shadow as something already familiar. He wrote, "Those who have suffered without witness will think it walks for them." That sentence may explain why the gospel was hidden rather than simply destroyed. The church feared its power not over scholars, but over the wounded. To someone who has suffered and been told to move on, the idea of a shadow that remembers every wound is not horrifying. It is comforting. It means nothing truly vanishes. It means pain denied by the world still has a witness. It means forgotten suffering is not forgotten everywhere, but comfort can become rebellion. If the wounded believe something sacred remembers what people erased, they become harder to silence. If victims believe history is not the final judge, they no longer need the approval of those who buried the truth. The shadow offered no doctrine, no church, no ritual. It offered only witness, and witness in the wrong hands can become more dangerous than prophecy. By the 15th century, references to the gospel had become rarer. Copies vanished from inventories, commentaries were removed from monastery shelves, paintings suspected of showing the second shadow were altered, painted over, or quietly relocated. In some cases, entire chapel murals were destroyed because the shadow beneath the cross appeared theologically improper. The official explanation was artistic correction. The unofficial fear was that people had started noticing. One account describes a fresco in a mountain church where Christ's shadow fell forward while every other shadow fell backward. Pilgrims began kneeling not before the crucifix, but before the darkness at its base. They left offerings there, scraps of cloth, locks of hair, names of the dead, and written accusations against those who had harmed them. Within a year, the fresco was plastered over. But plaster cracks. Years later, after dampness damaged the wall, the shadow beneath the paint began to show through again. Not the face of Christ, not the cross. Only the dark shape behind it, larger than before, as if the attempt to cover it had made it spread. That is the final reason the church feared the shadow. Not because it could defeat doctrine, but because it could survive beneath it. It could remain under paint, behind crucifixes, between lines of scripture, inside the memories of those who had seen too much and been believed too little. It did not need worship. It did not need a gospel. It only needed suffering to continue. And suffering has never been scarce. So the church did what institutions often do with truths too dangerous to deny and too powerful to explain. It buried the text, condemned the image, and warned the faithful not to look too closely at shadows cast by holy things. But the warning itself became a map. And somewhere in the centuries that followed, people began to understand what the hidden gospel had been saying all along. The shadow was not created to challenge the cross. It was created because of it. The strangest evidence for the gospel of the shadow Christ does not come from manuscripts alone. Texts can be burned. Inventories can be edited. Monks can be silenced, and forbidden pages can be sealed behind stone. But images are more difficult to erase completely, especially when the thing being hidden is not painted as a figure, but as something almost ordinary. A darkness, a shape, a shadow that seems, at first glance, to belong. Across Europe, scattered through churches, chapels, monastery walls, and private collections, there are crucifixion paintings that contain a detail most viewers never notice. Behind Christ, or just beneath the cross, there appears a second shadow. Not the expected shadow cast by his body, not the darkness produced by the wood of the cross. Something else. A shape that stands at the wrong angle, stretches in the wrong direction, or appears where no light source could have placed it. Art historians usually explain these anomalies as errors of perspective. Medieval and early Renaissance painters did not always follow modern rules of light, shadow, and proportion. Many worked symbolically rather than realistically, placing spiritual meaning above physical accuracy, yet certain paintings are harder to dismiss. In these works, every other shadow follows a consistent direction. Soldiers, ladders, spears, stones, and mourners all obey the same light. Only the darkness behind Christ does not. One example is said to have appeared in a small chapel outside Lucca, painted sometime in the late 1400s by an unknown artist. The fresco showed the crucifixion in traditional form, Christ upon the cross, Mary and John at either side, soldiers below, and a darkening sky above. But directly behind the base of the cross was a long vertical shape, almost human, leaning forward as though watching the wound in his side. It had no face, no hands, no painted details at all. It was merely shadow. Yet the villagers called it il secondo dolore, the second sorrow. Pilgrims began noticing it before the clergy did. Some claimed the dark shape appeared clearer when viewed from kneeling height. Others said it seemed to move as candles flickered, not like ordinary painted darkness, but like something responding to prayer. At first, the chapel welcomed the attention. Offerings increased. The wounded and grieving came to kneel before the fresco, leaving written prayers beneath the shadow instead of beneath the cross. That was when church officials intervened. The fresco was declared damaged and ordered repaired. A local painter was hired to brighten the wall, restore the figures, and cover the strange shape behind the cross. According to a later account, he painted over it 3 times. Each morning, the shadow had returned, faint but visible beneath the new pigment. On the 4th day, the painter refused to continue, claiming that the darkness was not on the wall, but inside the plaster. The chapel was eventually closed, and the fresco was hidden behind a wooden screen. Similar stories follow other works. In a Spanish panel painting from the 1500s, now believed lost, Christ's shadow reportedly fell backward across the hill, even though the sun was painted behind him. In a Greek icon from a remote island monastery, a dark shape appeared not behind the cross, but behind every wound. Tiny black halos gathered around the hands, feet, and side, each one painted with such delicacy that they looked intentional. When the icon was examined in the 19th century, the monks insisted no artist had added those details. They claimed the wounds had darkened over time. The most famous disputed case concerns a crucifixion painting attributed to a minor Flemish workshop in the early 1600s. For generations, the painting hung unnoticed in a private chapel. When it was restored in the 1920s, conservators removed layers of smoke damage and old varnish. Beneath the grime, they discovered a second form standing behind Christ, almost entirely hidden in the background darkness. It had no clear outline, yet its posture mirrored the body on the cross. The restorer described it in his notes as a silhouette of grief. The family who owned the painting quickly withdrew it from study. Officially, they claimed the restoration had damaged the work and made further examination impossible. Unofficially, letters suggest something else happened. The restorer began having nightmares of standing at Golgotha while something behind the cross counted wounds aloud. He could not remember the number upon waking, only that it was always increasing. Within a year, he abandoned restoration entirely and entered a monastery. What makes these paintings especially troubling is their distribution. They were not produced by a single artist, region, or movement. They appear centuries apart, in different countries, often in communities with no known connection to one another. The styles differ, the materials differ, but the anomaly remains the same: a second darkness near Christ, positioned as if the crucifixion cast more than one shadow. Some scholars argue that these images reflect the natural evolution of devotional art. Painters often used shadow to symbolize sin, grief, mortality, or the burden of humanity. A dark form behind Christ could easily represent the suffering of the world or the weight of human evil. That explanation is reasonable. It is also incomplete, because in several documented cases, the second shadow was not part of the artist's original design. Technical examinations of certain paintings reportedly found underdrawings that contained no such shape. In other words, the artist sketched the scene without the second shadow, but by the time the work was completed, the shadow appeared in the paint. Whether added later by the artist, a student, a restorer, or someone else entirely remains unclear. But in at least one case, pigment analysis suggested the dark shape had been painted at the same time as the rest of the piece, using the same materials, by the same hand. That raises a question more unsettling than forgery or symbolism. What if the artists did not choose to paint it? There are accounts of painters who claimed the shadow entered the work on its own. One 17th century artist in southern France wrote to his patron that he could not finish a crucifixion commission because the second grief keeps appearing beneath the cross. He scraped the panel clean twice. He changed the composition. He moved the light source. Still, the dark shape returned in his drafts, always in the same place, always slightly behind Christ. His patron dismissed him as unstable, but the unfinished panels were later found stacked in his studio, each one bearing the same impossible shadow. Even more disturbing are the paintings where the shadow is not immediately visible. Some only reveal it under candlelight. Others appear normal in daylight, but show the second figure in infrared imaging or restoration scans. A few are said to display it only from certain angles, forcing the viewer to stand where a mourner would have stood beneath the cross. It is as if the image requires grief as part of its perspective. This detail connects the paintings back to the forbidden gospel itself. The manuscript said the shadow was seen only by those whose grief had broken ordinary sight. Perhaps the paintings preserve that same condition. Perhaps most people can stand before them and see only a crucifixion. But those who come with wounds of their own, those who carry pain that has never been witnessed properly, notice the darkness behind the holy image and feel something in them answer. That may be why these paintings drew unusual devotion wherever they appeared. People did not simply pray before them. They confessed things to them. Not sins, but sufferings. Names of lost children, betrayals, tortures, diseases, injustices that were never acknowledged. The shadow became a place where pain could be left without explanation, because the faithful believed it already understood. Church authorities repeatedly tried to redirect such devotion toward accepted images and official saints. They warned that shadows were not to be venerated. They reminded worshippers that salvation came through Christ, not through any darkness behind him. But the people who knelt before the shadow were not always seeking salvation. Some were seeking witness. And witness, as the gospel of the shadow Christ had suggested, is sometimes the only mercy left when justice fails. By the modern era, many of these paintings had vanished. Some were destroyed in wars. Others were repainted, sold into private collections, or miscatalogued under harmless titles. But photographs survive, along with restoration notes, letters, and chapel records. And in those fragments, the second shadow keeps returning. Always near the cross, always slightly behind, always present where suffering is most visible. Perhaps the paintings are coincidences. Perhaps they are symbols produced by grieving artists, shaped by theology, trauma, and candlelight. But perhaps something else is happening. Perhaps the shadow did not only survive in a forbidden manuscript. Perhaps it entered the imagination of painters across centuries, guiding their hands toward a truth they did not fully understand. If the gospel of the shadow Christ was hidden, the paintings became its silent copies. Not written in words, but in darkness. Not preserved in books, but in pigment, plaster, smoke, and gold leaf. Each one repeating the same forbidden idea, that beneath the most sacred suffering in history, another presence stood and remembered. And unlike manuscripts, paintings do not need to be read aloud. They only need to be looked at. The gospel of the shadow Christ leaves behind a question that is difficult to carry. If the shadow existed, if even one fragment of the hidden text preserved something true, then the crucifixion did not end with the body taken down from the cross. Something remained at the edge of the story. Something stood behind the holy image and refused to let the wounds vanish into doctrine, painting, hymn, or silence. Perhaps that is why the text was feared. Not because it denied redemption, but because it suggested that redemption does not erase memory. The wound may be healed, but the fact of the wound remains. Blood may dry, but the place where it fell remembers. A body may rise, but the suffering endured by that body does not simply disappear into triumph. It leaves a shape behind. And that shape, according to the forbidden gospel, was the shadow. Not a demon, not an angel, not a rival to Christ, nor a second savior hidden behind him. The shadow was something stranger and quieter, a witness formed from pain itself. A presence born at the moment suffering became too vast for one body, one hill, one afternoon beneath a darkened sky. It did not speak because pain that old has no need for language. It did not intervene because witness is not rescue. It stayed because someone had to remember what the world would later try to soften. Across centuries, people have tried to make suffering easier to understand. They turn it into lessons, punishments, tests, sacrifices, or mysteries. Sometimes these meanings comfort. Sometimes they help people survive what cannot be changed. But sometimes meaning becomes another way of hiding the wound. Sometimes people rush toward redemption because they cannot bear to sit beside pain long enough to see what it truly cost. The shadow does not let us look away so quickly. That may be why the wounded recognized it. Those who had suffered without justice, those whose grief was dismissed, those whose pain was never witnessed properly, may have understood the shadow better than priests or scholars ever could. They did not see it as blasphemy. They saw it as confirmation, proof that what happened to them did not vanish just because others moved on. Proof that somewhere beyond courts, churches, history, and memory, something still carried the shape of what was done. And maybe that is why it appears in paintings, if the old stories are to be believed. Not because artists wanted to corrupt holy images, but because the shadow belonged there, behind the cross, beneath the wounds, near the places where suffering was made sacred, but not always understood. It entered pigment and plaster the way grief enters bone, quietly, permanently, waiting for the right eyes to notice. If the gospel of the Shadow Christ was only a legend, then it is still a powerful one. It tells us that no wound is truly unseen. It tells us that history may forget, institutions may bury, witnesses may fall silent, and names may vanish from every record. But suffering leaves an imprint somewhere. A second darkness, a memory behind the image, a presence that says, without words, this happened. But if the gospel was more than legend, then the shadow may still be walking. Not behind Christ anymore, perhaps, but behind humanity. Behind every battlefield where the dead are counted too quickly. Behind every hospital room where someone suffers alone. Behind every prison, every grave, every home where pain is hidden behind closed doors. Wherever a wound is denied, the shadow remembers. Wherever grief is silenced, the shadow stands close. Wherever mercy is spoken too soon, the shadow waits behind it. And that may be the final terror of the hidden gospel. It suggests that the world is not haunted only by spirits, demons, or the dead. It is haunted by what it has done. Haunted by pain that was never given a proper witness. Haunted by the wounds people were told to forget before they were allowed to heal. So the next time you see a crucifixion painting, look carefully. Not only at the face, not only at the hands, not only at the wound in the side. Look beneath the cross. Look behind the body. Look where the light should have fallen cleanly, but something darker remains. If you see nothing, perhaps that is mercy. But if you see a second shape waiting there, silent and bent beneath centuries of sorrow, do not call it evil too quickly. It may simply be remembering. Thank you for returning once again to Tales from the Forbidden Library. If tonight's story left something lingering in your thoughts, then stay close, because there are still hidden gospels, forbidden saints, lost prayers, and sacred shadows waiting between the shelves. Some stories are not buried because they are false. Some are buried because they remember too much.